All right, thank you very much for that introduction. Thank you everybody for coming here tonight. I lived in Florida many years ago on the other coast, and so it's really fun to come and explore this coast. And I've known Anton for over a decade now. To see what he's working on here has been really exciting. So today I'm going to talk about something you probably don't think about very often, which is life at the bottom of the ocean. And so to kind of get us started, I wanted to show you a cartoon about how I think about myself as a scientist. I think it's a really wonderful communication tool. But I'm a deep sea oceanographer, and I use advanced robotics to study life in some pretty strange places. But what I hope to convince you of today is that when we think about life on our planet, we need to include the whole planet. And the deep ocean makes up a very large habitable volume of our planet, and there's some really interesting life forms that we can learn a lot about. So when I say life, though, I want to be clear that I'm really talking about microbial life, and I'll get into that a little bit. But no matter what, whether you're a biologist studying microbes at the bottom of the ocean, or thinking about how cancer develops, or looking at elephant populations in Africa, I'm interested in some of the really big questions that I think unite a lot of both scientists and philosophers and authors and others. And it's really, how does life spread across our planet? How does it diversify? How do life and its environment co-evolve? How did that happen? What is it going to look like going forward? And really, what does the future of life look like? But I'm going to be focusing today on what I like to call planet microbe, or the microbial life on our planet. And just to make sure that we're all on the same page about what I mean when I say microbe, we're going to have a little microbiology one-on-one. For the record, microbiology was not taught when I went to high school, and you only took it at the college I went to if you were pre-med. So it seems worth mentioning what microbes are, just to be very clear here. So this is the universal tree of life in its most basic form. You are a eukaryote, and so is the FAU mascot, which is my understanding. It's a burrowing owl. Did I get that right? Yeah? Okay. It's not a microbe. All of these things are microbes. The two domains of life that are the bacteria and the archaea, these are single-celled organisms. They have no true nucleus. They have a single chromosome or a strand of DNA, and they have no membrane-bound organelles and simply divide by binary fission. So in many ways, these are very simple organisms. However, as I hope to convince you, they're actually remarkably diverse and powerful at exploiting almost every habitat on our planet. So that was the really simple tree of life that I just showed you. This is the much more complicated one. And this is a very hot topic in science right now. As the power of DNA sequencing develops, as our power to sample more and more environments on our planet increases, we're discovering a huge diversity of life. And on this tree, the microbes are all of these bacteria and all of these archaea down here. And again, for reference, you are down here. So why do we have so much microbial diversity on our planet? Well, microbes originated about 3.5 billion years ago in Earth's history, and have just had a huge amount of time to both fill every ecological niche as well as every metabolic niche you can imagine. In sheer biomass alone as well, microbes rule this planet. In a single gram of soil out here in the back, there's about 100 million microbial cells in a gram of that soil. There's more biomass or more carbon in microbial cells on our planet than plants and animals combined. And on our planet, there's more microbial cells than there are stars in the universe. So in sheer numbers, in terms of diversity, there's an amazing amount of microbes. In addition, they come in a huge diversity of forms and functions. So I think one reason people don't think about microbial life very much is much of it is invisible to the naked eye. You need a microscope to study it. But there are also larger structures that microbes can form, and they come in a lot of different shapes, colors, and sizes. These microbes also serve a huge diversity of function on our planet. I'm going to be talking about what they're doing in the deep ocean, but it's really important to remember that microbes are responsible for some of our favorite foods. They're responsible for our crops in the form of fixing nitrogen to make it available to the planet. You are covered inside and out of microbes, whether on your skin or in your gut. We get a lot of our medicines, which people here at Harbor Branch in particular are trying to study, from microbial communities. Microbes keep important ecosystems from the forest to coral reefs alive and functioning. And even when we really screw things up, microbes are first responders. In this case, with Deepwater Horizon, microbes within the Gulf of Mexico that were poised to munch away and eat at that spilled oil. So microbes are incredibly important both to human health and the planetary health. I think a great place to study them is in the oceans, and that's where I'm going to spend the rest of my talk. And I want to make sure you understand what microbes are doing in the ocean, and we'll move into the deep sea and really understand how extraordinary what they're doing there is. So this is my favorite map of the ocean, which is a little bit strange because I've actually subtracted the water out. So what you're looking at is a bathymetry map of the seafloor. And so obviously we recognize all of the continents, but these huge swaths of blue are normally covered in water. And the reason I like this map is because it really highlights how interesting the seafloor is in terms of features. And I'm going to be talking a good bit today about underwater volcanoes. And those underwater volcanoes form in areas where you see a lot of this action between tectonic plates on our planet. The world's largest mountain range is actually the mid-ocean ridge, which runs in the Pacific into the Indian Ocean and up around into the mid-Atlantic ridge. 50,000 kilometers, it's all underwater. 80% of the volcanism on our planet occurs underwater. So in these places, the plates are spreading apart. In other places, they're slamming into each other. In others, they're doing things like in Hawaii, where you have hotspot volcanism. And I'm really interested in the microbes living in the vast depths of our ocean underneath all of this water. And so I want to tell you about how these ecosystems work, but first I need to explain how they work right out here in the Indian River Lagoon or in the surface coastal ocean anywhere nearby. Now, if this were a scientific audience, I'd show this really confusing slide. I'm going to boil it down for you, but even in the surface ocean, which is incredibly well studied, it's very complex. We have microbes that are fixing energy from the sun in the form of phytoplankton, and this goes into a very complicated food web that cycles nutrients, carbon. There's eventually export into the deep ocean. But we can really take a simpler look at that and boil it down to some key players. And the first are these primary producers, again in the surface ocean in the form of phytoplankton or single-cell bacteria, like Anton studies. And this gets moved into a carbon pool, and then there are other microbes or bacteria, heterotrophic organisms that are consuming that carbon. So you have autotrophs, primary producers, making carbon that gets consumed by secondary heterotrophs, and then we move up into the food chain. We have things that graze on those bacteria, and so on, and up we go into the classic food chain. Also up, that's really important to understanding this food web, are groups of organisms that we only hear about during flu season, which I just got over, which are viruses. And these are actually really important in the environment. They're not just important when we think about human health. Viruses play a really critical role in the cycling of this carbon in our ecosystems, and also can do some really fun things shuttling genes around. Now in the deep ocean, what we need to do at the very bottom of the ocean is we need to flip this whole diagram over. And so now, instead of having primary producers that are fixing energy from the sun, what we have are organisms that are fixing energy from chemistry. These are organisms are taking chemical energy out of these water-rock reactions, in this case in an underwater volcano, and they serve as the primary producer of the ecosystem. We have a lot of the same players. We have these secondary bacteria, these heterotrophs, which are eating the carbon produced by these microbes. We have grazers. We now know we have viruses. We really have only figured that out in the last few years. But as you probably know, this ecosystem looks very different. And this is footage from the Galapagos Rift Zone, where hydrothermal vents were first discovered, actually almost exactly on this day in 1977. This was footage taken about 10 years ago to celebrate that discovery. But when these ecosystems were discovered, they were not hypothesized to exist. Nobody said there should be giant tube worms living in the bottom of the ocean packed full of bacteria eating hydrogen sulfide. Everybody thought the deep ocean was dead because there was no sunlight and the rain of organic carbon to the bottom was too low. But instead what they found were these lush communities that are being driven by microbes. So these tube worms have a pseudogut, it's called a trophosome, and it is packed full of bacteria that are taking hydrogen sulfide from the volcano, they're fixing their own CO2, creating new carbon, and that's what is sustaining the tube worms. Those tube worms that get preyed upon by, you can see little crabs around, you can then see octopus, you can see all these lush bacterial communities covering these rocks. And I always like to remind your students to learn the scientific method one way. There was no hypothesis. This was an absolute shock to scientists when they discovered these ecosystems. They didn't even have any preservatives to preserve the specimens on the ship. They had vodka. It was the 70s. We don't work that way anymore. My point being, no one said this could exist. And it really flipped biology on its end, the idea that you could sustain an ecosystem without sunlight. It was such hot news that it made the cover of the San Francisco Chronicle. David Perlman is an amazing scientific journalist still working for the Chronicle. And he was part of these series of voyages. And as I said, it really changed how we think about life on our planet, and as I'll talk about, kind of expanded our view about how we might think about life beyond our planet. So the reason, again, these ecosystems exist is because there's this crosstalk on our planet between these really fundamental geological processes, in this case, plate tectonics, and life, right? Those rocks are reacting with water, and they create energy that can support life. These microbes can eat things like methane, hydrogen, iron, manganese. These are not things we think about putting on our dinner plate, but these are the essential nutrients that these organisms need to thrive. And I want to just show you two examples of the very different range of how those water-rock reactions work and the type of life that they can support. So the first example is from the video I just showed you, where you take one particular type of rock called basalt, and you react it with water, and you get things like sulfide and iron. So if anyone's ever been, for example, to the Big Island of Hawaii, or seen the video footage of the exploding volcano of the Big Island, that's all basalt. And this is a type of rock that we find all throughout the oceanic crust. So again, when it reacts with water, it creates things that microbes love to eat, like sulfide and iron, and that supports those lush tube worm and other animal communities. What we've discovered in the last decade, though, and this was about what we knew for 20 years of deep sea exploration, and then in the early 2000s, we started finding ecosystems that look very different from these. And that's because they're being supported by a different rock type that's deeper in the oceanic crust, often kilometers down. And when it reacts with water, it makes things like hydrogen and methane and simple organic molecules, which are also delicious for microbes to eat. But these ecosystems, you can see, look very different. There's no black smokers there. There's no tube worm communities. They're much different chemosynthetic ecosystems being driven, in this case, by a hydrogen methane rather than a sulfide chemistry. So what we really have been learning is that there's a huge range of these types of water rock reactions that can sustain life on our planet. And ocean exploration over the last 25 years, with increased access to the deep sea through some of the technologies that you've seen here at Harbor Branch and other places, we've really been able to expand what we know about energy availability on our planet and the type of life it can support. And what I want to talk about today is just kind of the range of those conditions and how microbes can cope in those types of environments. So much of the research in my lab hits on a lot of these different types of settings. And the reason I continue to visit them, besides the fact that it's very fun, is that I'm using them as an access point to actually try to get beneath the seafloor. So this is a relatively new field called subsurface or subseafloor life, from this cartoon from Nature a few years ago called Low Life. And what it's simply illustrating is that underneath all this water, here's the oceanic crust that I've been talking about, there is actually life within the rocks and within the fluid moving through those rocks. Sometimes that rock gets covered with sediment, and it can be a few meters of sediment. It can be thousands of meters of sediment, depending on where you are in the world. And within these sediments and rocks, we can detect microbial life. Often it's thriving, often it's almost dead, but we can still detect it. And in many cases, we can go to these volcanic systems And these microbes are being spewed out into the water where we can sample them and make inferences about what's happening beneath the seafloor. Our other option is to get a drilling vessel and to drill into the sediments or the rocks and collect those samples, which I do every once in a while in my work, but is even more complicated in terms of the infrastructure and the technology needed. But scientists using scientific drilling have drilled 2,500 meters into deep sediments and still detected microbial life. They have gone thousands, about 1,500 meters into the rock and still detected microbial life. And I think we're sort of on the cusp of discovery in trying to understand really what limits those microbial forms in those different environments. So in my lab, I'm especially interested in this concept of water moving through rock, right? It isn't something we think about, but a great way to think about it is if you had a jar of marbles, right? And there's a lot of space between those marbles. And that's really what the oceanic crust is like. It's very porous, especially in young crust. And you have water moving through the rock. And we call this the ocean crustal aquifer. It doesn't have a lot of catchy names, but it's really, you can think about it sort of like a conveyor belt beneath the ocean that water is moving through, and that water is getting modified because it reacts with rock. Sometimes it's at very high temperatures and you have an underwater volcano. And I'm very interested in the microbes that are living down there, what their exchange with the overlying ocean is like, what impact that might have on cycling of carbon, for example, and other such questions. If we were to kind of pause the planet, just say stop, at any single point in time, about 2% of the whole volume of our world's oceans is trapped within the crust. So this isn't just a little place, right? It's a huge part of the ocean. It's just very inaccessible. So the types of questions my research addresses, and I promise this is my heaviest text slide, is from the very, very basic, like who's there? How many cells are there, right? What are the detection limits of the life in these environments? What do they do all day? Are they eating iron? Are they fixing carbon? Are they making methane? How can we understand what they're doing and build that into some of our biogeochemical models for how our planet works? The things I've showed you from the surface ocean, does that exist beneath the seafloor? Are there viruses? I can say yes to that. Are there grazers? I don't know quite yet. How deep does it go? What controls that? And many other questions. When we do, for example, this really deep ocean drilling, we're also going very far back in time, in some cases hundreds of millions of years. What can we learn from microbes in those very deep sediments, for example, that can help us understand Earth's past and potentially the future as well? So perhaps the most fun part of my job is when I get to put on my ocean explorer hat, go make a map of some place no one's ever been before, and do some dives and take a look at what's there. And so the lab has been working around the globe. They mentioned that I did my PhD up here in the University of Washington, just off the coast of Seattle, which is an underwater volcano I've been working at for many years, but also sort of expanding across the world's oceans, taking advantage of ships of opportunity to study them. And again, I already mentioned there's a huge array of water-rock reactions that can support life, and I just really want to emphasize that these systems don't just come in one size, right? There's just a huge diversity of ecosystems, and we are discovering new species, new types of chemical reactions, and new animals as well. So just because Harbor Branch is also, a little bit of an engineering hothouse, I thought I'd mention a little bit about how we actually get these samples and what it's like being a seagoing oceanographer. So when we go to sea, we go out for anywhere from 2 to 8 weeks at a time. This is an example of the RV Atlantis, operated by Woods Hole Oceanographic. This is the home ship of the deep sea diving submersible Alvin. And so often we need to use some sort of vehicle to get deep. It was really awesome. I got to see the Johnson Sea Lynx today, which I've seen on Discovery Channel, and it was just really fun to see them. These are some different vehicles that go deeper. Most of the systems that I study are at least a mile deep, if not more. So like the Sea Link, this is the manned submersible Alvin. This takes 3 people down. It gets launched from its home ship, the Atlantis, right after breakfast. You stay down all day, you have a productive work day, you eat peanut butter and jelly for lunch, and you come up at dinner time. So it's a full work day on the seafloor. Right now, Alvin is rated to dive to about 4,500 meters. The bulk of the work and the videos I'll be showing you today, though, have been collected using remotely operated vehicles. And once you see a couple of the videos, you'll understand why. In many cases, they're beyond the depth rating of Alvin, and in other cases, they're just situations that you don't want to put people in. It's just a bit too dangerous to have a manned submersible around. So this is the remotely operated vehicle Jason, which is rated to 6,500 meters, also operated by FAU. And so this is a tethered vehicle. There's no people in this. It can go down. Actually, the photograph on the front of your pamphlet is from the Jason ROV van, where all the scientists are sitting back up comfortably on the ship, working with the engineers and pilots, taking samples, navigating dives. And this vehicle can stay down for days on end. The longest dive I've ever done with Jason was for 5 days, and just up on the ship, we're rotating off and on schedules to keep the science going. This vehicle down here, I keep telling myself I should take it out of my talk, but I don't. This is the Nereus deep diving vehicle, which went to the Mariana Trench, the world's deepest part of the ocean, in 2011, I want to say. And it was, the first time Americans had had a presence at the deepest point in the ocean in almost 50 years. But sadly, Nereus imploded at the Kermadec Trench a few years ago, which highlights again how hard it is to go very, very deep in the ocean. Just the pressure is immense. And, if I'm doing a dive in Alvin to 1,500 meters, the equipment can't just go onto Jason and dive at 5,000 meters. Everything has to be pressure tested. Everything has to be made sure it can handle the pressure. You add another click down to 11,000 meters, and things get very difficult. One final way that we've started to collect our science in oceanography is also using more observatories. And the example I'm showing here is a cabled observatory off the Pacific Northwest, where there's basically a giant power cord running from land out to an underwater volcano. And the idea is that we can hook in sensors, instrumentation, we can monitor it without ever having to go on a ship. And this is very new to ocean sciences, and I think the jury is still out about how it's going to work, especially for people like me who really need samples to do their science. But it's definitely a wave of the future for a lot of ocean sciences. So this is a gratuitous shot of me in Alvin, just because I'm wearing a geology hat. It's really cold at the bottom of the ocean, so it's not temperature regulated. So while it might be warm and cozy at the surface, you get to the bottom. This was at about 2,200 meters. It gets a little chilly, and you can see the little portholes back here to observe what's happening. When we use an ROV, as I already mentioned, and is on your pamphlet, we are seeing things in a 2D world, but we try to recreate it as much as possible with as many flat screens as we can. So sitting in the front row are 3 engineers for the remotely operated vehicle, and the scientists are in the back row tapping them on the shoulder, saying just a little bit to the right, pick that up, and that's how we get the bulk of our samples. Back in my lab, we use a lot of different tools to study these microbes, ranging from very basic chemistry to trying to bring these microbes back to life in the laboratory, using cultivation techniques where we remove the oxygen, we give them hydrogen, we stick them in ovens, we do all sorts of things to try to get them to come back to life. And of course, we use now the power of genomics to really dig into their DNA, to understand their evolutionary histories and other relationships. And as I already mentioned, there's a lot of sort of armchair engineering, trying to build the right samplers, trying to work with the technical teams to make sure what we want to do is actually possible, and really adapting to both the environment and the vehicle we're using. So that's how we get our samples, and this is how we bring the microbes back to the laboratory to study them and ask questions about what they're doing in the environment, who they're related to, what they're eating, and things like that. And so what I wanted to do now is talk about a few of the extremes that these microbes encounter in the environment. And I put extremes in quotes here because it's extreme to you and me, right? I mean, you guys live in Florida. It's like the least extreme right now. It's like perfect. But these microbes encounter a huge range of conditions, and they've adapted to those conditions. So they're extreme to you and me. And what I want to do is just go through a few of these to give you some examples of what I mean in terms of how they cope. So, you know, it ranges from extremely high to low temperatures, high pressures, the salt, the pH, oxygen, carbon, and metals. So the first one I want to talk about up here is how they cope with some of these temperatures. So temperature is a really interesting thing to think about in terms of how life adapts. So this is a plot that is just showing, you know, the range of temperatures that life lives in on our planet. And I have plants and mammals labeled up here, right here. And really the subsea floor, from these very cold, deep sediments to these very high temperature volcanic systems, it spans a huge, huge range. All of these other bars represent microbes that can grow across these really wide temperature ranges, from the very cold, or the psychrophiles, to the very hot, the thermophiles. These microbes, their names might be a little bit obvious here, but at the hot end, these are heat lovers, and over here, we have cold lovers. This is a very interesting area of research where scientists are constantly trying to push the limits in either direction, both hot and cold. The current record holders at the hot end grows at about 250 degrees Fahrenheit. It was isolated from a deep sea hydrothermal vent. And actually the way they got this organism to grow at such a high temperature was by putting it under a lot of pressure as well, really replicating the conditions from which it came. At the low end, this is an organism that was isolated from Arctic sea ice that can grow at these very low temperatures. So just in terms of temperature, there's a huge range that microbes can exploit compared to, you know, us measly mammals right here. At the high temperature end, there's been a lot of research trying to understand how microbes can deal with that high temperature. And a lot of that has been for biotechnological applications as well as industry. And it's really going back to the genetic code to understand how these organisms do it. So for example, we all know that DNA is double-stranded and tightly coiled, but in these high temperature bugs, it's even more tightly coiled. And the idea is to keep those strands together so they don't melt in these really high temperatures. This then moves on into amino acids, which DNA gets translated into, and there are very specific preferences, and scientists think it has to do with how those amino acids can handle high temperature. And finally, when this gets moved into proteins, like the DNA, the proteins are simply folded in and packed more tightly so that it takes a lot more energy to unravel them. They have stronger bonds, and all of these things confer more thermal stability to these organisms. These enzymes from these types of microbes have been highly exploited in both industry and biotechnology. The molecular biology revolution happened thanks to the discovery of a high temperature stable enzyme from a microbe that grew at high temperature that was actually isolated from Yellowstone hot springs. So the second thing I wanted to talk about is this idea of these organisms living beneath the seafloor, not having much oxygen and having very little organic carbon, right? We all live on organic carbon, right? The plants fix the energy from the sun. They create the plants. You know, we either eat the plants or we eat the cow that eats the plant. But in the subsea floor, where there's little oxygen and little carbon, how do these organisms get by? As I've mentioned, they have these metabolisms that they can really exploit this chemical energy. So I've put two examples up here, one within the domain of the archaea and the other within bacteria. So up here in the archaea, these are methanogens. These are organisms that simply eat CO2 and hydrogen to make methane. Now, these are some of the most successful organisms of our planet. This seems like a strange metabolism. These are actually in your gut. They're in rice paddy soils. They are in all sorts of freshwater environments. These are very successful organisms that can live from below zero in excess of 250 degrees. So these are highly successful organisms with what one might call a simple metabolism that's been remarkably successful. Down here is a group of bacteria. This is a microscopy image I took We called this bug the snot bug for obvious reasons, I think. But this is a bacteria that eats hydrogen and sulfur. Now, neither of these organisms require oxygen, and neither of these organisms require organic carbon. All they require are these energy sources and CO2, and they can get by just fine. And so this is an example of not needing either the oxygen or organic carbon. And finally, I wanted to mention these are not always the most stable environments to live in, and these organisms can really cope just fine. And this is a video from a deep sea eruption off the Pacific Northwest coast, and I'm showing it to illustrate that these eruptions, while very disruptive if you're a tube worm, right, because you die, are actually a really great source of energy for deep sea microbes. And all that white stuff that you see that kind of looks like snow is actually elemental sulfur. And that's being produced because with these eruptions, a bunch of new energy comes into the system, and these microbes can exploit that. And in this case, they're oxidizing it. This is it being collected into the remotely operated vehicle sampler. There we are picking up a rock. It is covered in these biofilms. So these are actually, eruptions are highly productive and a positive for microbial communities. It brings a new source of energy into the environment and into the deep ocean. And it's all chemical energy, which thus produces new carbon. So these eruptions then feed these deep sea microbes. And here's another electron microscopy image that we looked at, this snow material coming out, and it is just chock full of a bloom of microbes. You guys often think around here about the harmful algal blooms or other types of phytoplankton blooms. This is the deep sea version, and no harm is caused to anybody. In addition, these eruptions are a great opportunity for scientists like me because a lot of fluid that's been trapped in the crust comes out. And this is an opportunity for us to find and study these novel organisms that we often do not have access to. Some of the most interesting metabolisms and organisms we found have come from these types of environments. However, not all deep sea eruptions look the same. So this is an eruption from the western Pacific near the island of Samoa, and this doesn't look good for anybody, right? This is about a mile beneath the sea surface, and what you're seeing are these basically lava bombs that are being thrown up into the ocean, and the viewing scale here is only about 50 meters across. So while this is a huge mountain that comes up off the seafloor, this imprint of this eruption is very shallow or very small. And what you're seeing in the front there is the remotely operated vehicle, Jason. This is an instance where we can't take a human. And so instead, we take an ROV and keep our fingers crossed. But what's really remarkable about this eruption is that that plume of material above it is about pH 1. I mean, it's incredibly acidic. It's basically battery acid. It's full of sulfuric acid. These lava bombs are in excess of 1,200 degrees. Yet I can collect the material just above the volcano, and I can look under a microscope, and I can see microbes, and I can detect their genes. And so it's just, you know, this is a very different flavor of eruption, but still microbes have adapted to take advantage of the huge energy that's coming out of this system, in this case in the form of sulfur. And if you move just about 20 meters in either direction, there are these lush microbial mats, and there are little shrimp feeding on those microbial mats. And so in this type of eruption, even though it looks very different from the other, life still seems to find a way. So in my final, let's say 10 minutes, what I really wanted to kind of talk about is not so much the basic science of this, but all the other things that studying life in the deep ocean can make you think about, which is really how I became enamored with the topic. When I went to Eckerd College, I wanted to study dolphins with 80% of the incoming class. And, you know, I'm from the landlocked Midwest, and that was my vision of what ocean sciences was, based on Jacques Cousteau and going to the Shedd Aquarium. When I was in college, I really became excited about the idea of using microbes to understand everything from deep time on our planet to thinking about life beyond our planet. And in many ways, it's kept me really occupied, the ability to kind of step out of my science and think about some of the bigger questions and the implications of my work for others. So I wanted to show a few examples of some things that we've started thinking about, many have been thinking about for quite some time, in relationship to this very multidisciplinary science. And the first has to do with taking from the deep sea. So we all know the oceans are under a huge amount of pressure in terms of exploitation, but it seemed for many, many years that the deep sea was out of reach. It is a hard place to work, as I've mentioned, it's far from land. But this concept of mining the deep ocean for precious minerals that we need in our laptops and our cell phones is becoming more and more of a reality. So this is a very, interesting headline from an article about deep sea mining. This was just, that came out last spring. And this is an image of one of these deep sea robots that's been developed to mine these large deposits of minerals on the seafloor that we find at these hydrothermal systems. We build these large volcanoes and other structures, and they have trace amounts of things like gold, copper, and zinc. And the idea is that we can mine them to get those valuable materials out. This is obviously a great controversy, and I urge you, if it's of interest, just yesterday the BBC has a wonderful piece. It's called Secrets on the Ocean Floor, that takes us all the way from the original discovery of life in the deep sea to what's happening with deep sea mining right now. There is a company in Canada who has the rights to do this deep sea mining off the coast of Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea's landscape has been destroyed by mining on land, and they gave the rights to this company to do this deep sea mining. Nautilus, to its credit, has very much involved scientists in trying to get baseline data on understanding this, but it has not quite started yet. And it's a fierce debate about whether or not it should start at all, and if it starts, how do we study how the system reacts or doesn't to this type of large disturbance. So this is an example where the deep sea is really under pressure, even in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. There are countries that have already claimed stakes to some Atlantic regions of the mid-Atlantic ridge for deep sea mining. So some people want to take from the deep ocean. Others have thought about using the deep ocean as a sink. These were two articles that were published in a fairly prestigious scientific journal about carbon sequestration. So a way to get CO2 out of our atmosphere and bury it in the deep ocean. In this example, in deep sea sediments, and in this example, in those deep sea rocks I talked about, the deep sea basalts. To my knowledge, nobody is doing this at a high capacity yet. I know it's been tested in both Japan and Europe. But of course, what we want to make sure of is everything we put down there stays down there. And I study microbes that fix CO2 for a living. This is what they do. They eat it, and they make new carbon. And so thinking about the idea of stuffing it all down there, how long would it really stay down there, especially in a climate that's changing and warming? So this is another example of pressure on the deep sea in terms of human impacts. There are some really exciting lines of inquiry, though, that really focus on using the organisms from the deep ocean. And there's folks here at Harbor Branch and elsewhere who are studying these strange metabolisms and the genes and the chemicals they produce to benefit you and me. So the first example shown up here is taking some of these organisms that can do things like only eat hydrogen and CO2, for example. They don't need sunlight, so you can grow them basically underground, right? They don't take up a lot of land mass. And tweaking their genome so that they produce something like isobutanol, or a chemical that's of industrial relevance. And this is a very, very hot area of research that scientists are doing. A group at Vanderbilt recently found a new antibiotic in a microbe from a deep sea vent organism. I really love this image. It's a black smoker with prescription pills flying out of it. Never seen that. This was in the press release. It's amazing. But they weren't looking for this. They were mining genomes, looking for interesting patterns. And they found a gene. They were able to show in the lab that it could kill bacteria. It turns out to be pretty universal across the tree of life. and they're trying to patent it right now. So as we know, we have a huge problem with antibiotic overuse and microbial resistance, and this is a new line of inquiry. And then down here at the bottom, this is from an article that was in the Journal of Natural Products, and there are folks here at Harbor Branch who know a lot more about natural product discovery than I do. But a couple years ago, I went to sea with a group from a school of pharmacology who were interested in looking at some of those microbial mats and some of the other interesting organisms that we're finding down there to see if there were any new drugs or new anti-cancer or other natural products with high activity. So in this case, we don't need to destroy the ecosystem. We can simply sample it and study the organisms back in the laboratory. And there's a lot of things we can learn about studying these organisms and their genes without destroying the environment. So this is an example of a group of bacteria that span from the human gut all the way to the deep sea. And I'm going to walk you through this. This is something called a phylogenetic tree, which I showed you at the very beginning of the whole, all life on our planet. This is just looking at this one group of bacteria. And the ones here are ones you might have heard about because they hurt us. They can cause gastric ulcer, in some cases cancer. This is Helicobacter, H. pylori, which we're often tested for at the doctor. And then another group of bacteria that can contaminate our food or drinking water, Campylobacter. So until about 15 years ago, this is what we thought existed within this group. But we now know that there's two other groups of these bacteria found in the environment. Some found both in marine and terrestrial sulfidic systems, and then a group that we only find at vents, at deep sea hydrothermal vents. These are organisms that fix their own carbon. They do things like eat hydrogen and sulfur. And when we build trees like this, we see that they are the most ancient group within this entire group of bacteria. Yet when we start digging into their genes, we can see that even after millions and millions and millions of years of divergence, they still have some similar functions. For example, to infect us, these bugs down here, they need to be able to evade us, right? Our host, our immune system. And we can see that in their genes. We also see that in the vent bacteria, who are often living in associations with animals and don't want the animals to kick them out. So we can kind of see these linkages between these pathogens and these organisms, these very ancient organisms free living in the environment. And that really makes you think about life on our planet, where it might have originated. And one very popular area of research is thinking about, could life have originated in these deep sea ecosystems? This is a very simplified version of Earth's history. So on the X down here is billions of years before present. So 4.5 billion years ago is when our planet formed. And the first billion years or so of our Earth's history was pretty ugly. It was the heavy bombardment period. It's thought to be very hot. There was no oxygen in our atmosphere. It was a pretty nasty place. But we have evidence for rocks back to 4.2 billion years ago. These are continental rocks. And we know our oceans were present by about 4 billion years ago. And then there's some evidence for life. It's very good here at 3.5, a little more controversial going back to 3.7 billion years ago. For most of our planet's history is a microbial game, right? We don't see, quote unquote, higher life, origins of multicellularity, until we have this buildup of atmospheric oxygen. So for most of our planet's history, it didn't have oxygen, it was a little bit warm, and there was no eukaryotic or higher life. So here we are, the dinosaurs just died. So when we think about, could life have originated in the deep ocean, we can look at other lines of evidence thinking about how that might be possible. One interesting line of work is that a lot of these organisms that I've been talking about, these methanogens, these sulfur reducers, when you look at them, they're very ancient metabolisms. These are not things that evolved recently. And many of those organisms are also living at high temperature. And so there's some suggestion that when we kind of look at the tree of life and look at what is at the potential root of it, they're hot and they have a lot of similar metabolisms as to what we see in the deep sea today. We can add to that these microbes or these hydrothermal systems, and I mentioned some of them, can actually make organic carbon without any life present at all. And this is a really hot area of abiotic chemistry where, because of those water rock reactions, you can build molecules like ethane or propane or things like that. And these are some of the building blocks of life. So if we kind of take all of these things together, we know that early on in Earth's history, the oceans were present. The deep sea was not getting bombarded during the heavy bombardment. It was protected. We know there was no oxygen, and the Earth was quite warm. So if you have these ecosystems that were obviously originally sterile, but you have a system that's protected, you can have geochemistry happening that makes building blocks for life. And in our extant system, we have organisms that look very ancient. Many people think that this is a great place to have had life originate. This is a super controversial area. This is a topic, this was in the New York Times not that long ago, called Meet Luca. Luca is the last universal common ancestor, the ancestor of all living things, and they put up a picture of a smoker. What we really have to remember, though, is all the life we measure on Earth today is the life on Earth today. We have no fossil record of microbial life. There could have been hundreds or millions of other species in microbes on this planet, and we simply have no record of them because they don't exist in the fossil record. So while they may be relatives, our last universal common ancestor, it's very hard to say for certain. It's one of these wonderful areas of science because we'll never prove anything. So it's a lot of fun to talk about. And finally, I think it's pretty obvious when we start thinking about the origins of life on our planet to start thinking about life beyond our planet. And this has really been inspired by the discovery of these amazing chemosynthetic ecosystems sustained without sunlight. On the left here is Mars. On the right, Jupiter's moon Europa, which is an ice-covered moon. And in the last 10 years, we've actually discovered a huge number of oceans of our solar system. So, our planet is pretty exceptional in many ways, but it turns out there's quite a few oceans in our solar system, including Saturn's moon Titan, Ganymede, and here again is the ice-covered Europa, as well as Saturn's moon Enceladus. Scientists have even gone so far on Enceladus, that little one at the top, to predict that there's hydrothermal systems there. And that's because the Cassini mission, which is now burned off into our solar system, did a couple flybys in Enceladus and detected very high hydrogen concentrations in plumes being ejected out of the ice surface. If we're going to be looking for life outside our planet, planets with oceans are probably a very, very good place to look first. And NASA has launched an ocean worlds exploration program to hopefully do exactly that. Obviously, though, this is where we're starting. This is what we have. We have a huge ocean on our planet, a giant habitable volume, diverse organisms, diverse geology that supports a huge range of chemical reactions that support life and is essential to supporting our life on this planet as well. So some takeaways to remember is that really the discovery of these deep sea ecosystems changed our view of life both on and beyond Earth, and that it's these very basic reactions between water and rock that create the energy sources that support all this microbial life. Even beneath the seafloor, we have a global oceanic habitat. It's of a huge volume, and it's ruled by these amazing microbes that have found a way to exploit almost every habitable niche. And in the sense of how well we've explored, the deep sea really remains relatively unexplored. We don't even have a great map of the bottom of the ocean. And just to convince you of that, my final video is one of the wackiest places I've ever visited, which is all the way in the Western Pacific along the Mariana Arc. And these are very volatile volcanoes, and in this case, they're spewing out elemental sulfur around pH 2. And yet these crabs are totally fine. They're covered in filamentous bacteria, and those bacteria are feeding off that elemental sulfur that they're gathering from their surroundings, and the ecosystem is absolutely thriving. And these types of hydrothermal systems are as different as, a jar of candy that you get. And it's really amazing to continue to find new things like this that when you show it to people, they assume it's another planet. because it looks so different from anything we know, yet it's out there. It just happens to be on the ocean floor, which is pretty hard to get to. So my final message is that whether it's the deep sea or your Indian River Lagoon right here, most of these marine ecosystems, they're all important, and almost all of them are understudied. Whether we're talking about microbes or the resources we can take from the ocean, how climate's going to impact it, it demands very big multidisciplinary science. Ocean scientists do not sit in their offices by themselves. They talk to the people down the hall, across the street, across the globe, and that's how we make this type of big science happen. So the work in my lab has been funded by a variety of sources, our federal government, as well as a number of private resources. And with that, I am happy to take any questions.